Hi, this is the Philosophical Angle program, and I am your host, Chris Angle. I'm the author of 4 books on philosophy, one of which is the Philosophical Equations of Economics. And with me is my colleague and co-host, Rick Samuelson, a venture capitalist on the West Coast. Good to see you, Rick.
Good to see you.
The purpose of the Philosophical Angle is to examine the nature of concepts being used in current media. And this week we're going to discuss New York City's recently was declared, the MTA there was recently declared a state of an emergency by Governor Cuomo on June 29th or June 30th. And it seemed like for a week or two everything seemed to go wrong for the MTA. And then we heard Governor Cuomo declared a state of emergency because of all the accidents and poor performance of the trains and subways in and around New York City, including Penn Central or Penn Station. And it's been very bad, and understandably the government stepped in because there was a howl of protest over this thing. And how could this happen? Is this to be expected? Is it to be tolerated? Just a normal course of business for the MTA. Well, how does this compare with the rest of the world? Well, if we compare the MTA to the rest of the world, just taking a cursory look, it would seem to me that the rest of the world does a far better job than the MTA. Oh boy. And I mean, like Japan provides quality transportation, and Europe is pretty good at it also. You can set your clocks by the precision by which Japan runs its tracks. And so when you compare the MTA with the likes of Japan or Europe, the MTA does a pretty poor job. So the philosophical angle would first and foremost like to put the blame of the MTA being owned and operated by a government. And yes, I know you have one objection, and that's well founded, in that most of the trains of Japan and throughout the world are owned and operated by government. So why is New York any different in its ability to provide a quality product? Well, I'm going to counter this by saying that train systems in other parts of the world at least have some lines that are privately owned or operated, and thus they afford at least some competitive behavior to be present alongside the government's owning and operating a mass transit system. So in order for the MTA to improve, either they need to allow competition to enter the mass transportation market, or they need to sell their system of mass transportation to private enterprises, and they need to do it for 2 reasons. First, any government cannot perform anything as well as private enterprise, especially when in considering the supply of goods and services to a mass market. And secondly, it is a monopoly, and thus competition can't come in and make it efficient. So why can competition in every instance bring to a market more efficiency and necessarily be able to bring to the market a more efficient product than a monopolistic situation? What is the nature of competition that necessarily improves market conditions and brings necessarily efficiency to the competitors? I think the first thing we need to do is define competition. And if we just kind of go to Merriam-Webster dictionary, it says that, and I'll read it here, competition is the active demand by 2 or more organisms for some environmental resource in short supply. And in Wikipedia, it says that economic competition is the rivalry among sellers trying to achieve such goals as increasing profits, market share, and sales volume by varying the market mix of price, product, distribution, and promotion. And these are similar and pretty consistent with each other, I think. But to further the explanation, when two life entities seek the same priority of goodness, and I think the definition of Merriam-Webster when it said rivalry, did it say rivalry? Yeah, well, the Wikipedia said rivalry. So when two life entities seek the same priorities of goodness, and that's a rivalry, compared to the one seeking a goodness, if it's two or more, obviously the goodness needs to be divided by two, and as such, each entity has the potential to receive less goodness. So when one entity has decided on any particular priority, such as farming some piece of land, and another one comes along and with the same priority of farming the same land, this is automatically divided in half. And the automobile market or any product in the marketplace is no different. If you had an automobile market like we have in the United States, and it's a certain size at any one particular point in time, if there's one company in that marketplace and suddenly along comes another, then the marketplace is divided in half. It's pretty obvious. Thus, direct competition, we can conclude, is inimical to one's health. And we can derive one of economics' basic dictums, including one of biology and evolution's basic dictums, which is that all of life tries to avoid competition, especially direct competition. That is, the more life converges on the same priority, the more that a life entity wants to avoid direct competition. And in order to avoid direct competition, any life entity, any economic entity, will try to differentiate. It will try to effectuate divergence away from the common priority. Okay, so now we're going to go back to government. The first reason that a government cannot provide a service or product nearly as well as any private company is that the government motivation incentive factor for its workers is usually very minimal. And if we remember that the motivational incentive ratio is the amount of the sacrifice relative to the reward that any person does to achieve some goal, we can see how this motivation for government workers depreciate over time. Is well known that government workers have very strong unions, which makes up its contracts, and they're very difficult for government workers to be fired or punished for any kind of workplace violation or transgression. And therefore, no matter whether the sacrifice by the government worker increases or decreases, the reward stays the same. That is, the incentive to work depreciates, especially over time. So the sacrifice means the amount of work that an employee does, and the reward is, of course, the payback is the payback that he's going to take home, his paycheck that he gets for his sacrifice at the workplace. And so within each workplace, within each sacrifice, there's always goodness. And the government worker shows up and does this to achieve his reward. And inside that reward is his paycheck, which he can take home and enjoy. And the paycheck supplies the wherewithal for his family to proceed with their lives. And obviously, there is goodness. And the private sector is no different. People go to work to produce a good service, and they're given a paycheck also, and they take it home to spend in their lives. And so there's really no difference. Which brings us to the second dimension, and that which is the difference between a government enterprise and a private enterprise. And the private free marketplace where goods are exchanged, there is a transfer of goodness to both sides of the transaction. You're going to sacrifice what you have for the goodness of the reward. And a manufacturer of the product sacrifices his time and the knowledge and materials to make a product, and he does so thinking that the product will bring goodness to somebody's lives, and it brings something that is, if it brings something that's bad, then no one's going to buy it. So the manufacturer brings his product to a store or a showroom, or a marketplace, and potential buyers come around with their money that they've gained from their sacrifices that they've made previously, and they've exchanged their money, which holds goodness, and they exchange that goodness for the goodness of the manufacturer. However, in a government enterprise, goodness can be impaired because, as we mentioned just previously, sometimes government workers' motivational incentive depreciates over time, and so the amount of goodness that they create per capita depreciates also. Thus, the amount of goodness that is transferred in the marketplace to the buyers of governmental products and services depreciate to an extent due to the motivational factors involved, in which that the government workers get a certain paycheck no matter how well they perform, no matter how badly they perform, no matter how bad their product or service is. So there's actually one more reason for the depreciation of the goodness held within a product or generated by a government entity, and this additional reason is that the government entity is generally a monopoly and not subject to competition. The government can enter, the government can deliver any product, no matter what its extent of holding goodness is, to the consumer, whether it is better or worse. The consumer has no choice because it's a monopoly. So now, we have to understand the impact of competition in the marketplace. The first thing we need to do is define competition again more precisely and see where it leads us. So, what we need here is a philosophical definition of the economics of competition. And the definition of competition is the convergence and divergence of priorities of an entity that produces a product or a service. And I can just see you out there going, what? Well, to explain, as two companies begin fighting for the same customer in the same marketplace, that is, their priorities have converged onto the same marketplace, they change or diversify their product line to avoid inhabiting the same economic niche. And I'll give an example here. Supposing there's a car company producing cars into the same marketplace. However, if a housewife desires a mommobile and only one company makes mommobiles, then the market which holds the knowledge, that is the priorities of the mothers, dictates to the mom which mommobile the mom's going to need, or which she's able to get. However, when two or more companies decide to add their presence to that marketplace and fulfill their priorities in manufacturing a mommobile, the priorities of the companies converge. If their priorities are the same, then they're producing similar cars to sell to similar consumers. Their priorities converge onto the same priorities of the customers, of the consumers. So, amazingly enough, though, this competition creates necessarily divergence, which results in necessarily economic efficiencies. And this divergence proceeds because of two laws of economics. One, the law of unlimited demand for goodness. And two, because competition is inimical to one's health. Whether it be a living entity or a company or a corporation, due to convergence, it fosters divergence. Once the company has converged onto the same market priority as another company, the company will try to diverge because of its position in direct competition, and the market share has become divided. But companies want to take as much market share as possible, and because that leads to goodness in the form of profit. So naturally, it tries to diverge away from the competitive marketplace, and it does so by increasing its knowledge through research, which helps it produce diversified products with greater goodness, and it will do this by improving the product, making different types of the product, diversifying its characteristics, differentiating its cost, and usually try by reducing its cost. But it could go the other way, by adding luxury and therefore adding cost. But in whatever direction the company chooses, in order to improve its market performance, the company must differentiate and diverge away from its competitor. So you see how companies do this by just going to a store and looking at the product lines and the variation of products that are on the shelves. Companies produce all sorts of innovative products, reducing its costs. They've got they separate themselves entirely. So the consequences of this is that competition increases the quality of product, yet reduces the cost of the products through this concept of convergence and divergence of its priorities. But we mentioned something else about unlimited demand, and the buyer or consumer is ever looking to increase goodness for himself and his family. If a product provides goodness, there can be a demand for it that will be a desire for it. And the consumer is limited by how much money he has, but the desire for greater goodness remains in place. And with this in place, companies are ever trying to produce greater quality at less price, as this will provide greater goodness to the consumer, which is the divergence of which we're speaking about. So, as the government is its own monopoly in producing whatever service it is providing, it will of course be inferior to private companies who perform inside a free marketplace under the pressures of convergence and divergence. And for proof of this, and proof of all of this, is all we have to do is look to the declaration by Governor Cuomo of the state of emergency for the New York City MTA, and either the ownership or at least just the operation or both need to be sold to a private enterprise in order for the transportation system of New York City's MTA to improve. Rick, what do you think about this situation of New York's MTA? Should they privatize, remain as they are? Or what's your opinion?
I haven't looked at the finances, particularly of New York MTA. However, I would make a couple of observations on the whole issue of deferred maintenance, because you see it not just in transportation systems that are government run, but also in school systems and elsewhere. Deferred maintenance tends to fall between two stools. You've got the unions, as you mentioned, that want to be satisfied first in terms of compensation and benefits, and then from the perspective of the taxpayer that ultimately funds all this stuff, the most easily sold investment in infrastructure are invariably capital projects, new subway lines or new schools or what have you. And as that installed infrastructure increases, obviously the maintenance requirements increase too over time. But invariably, again, as you allude to obliquely, the demands by the unions to satisfy wage and or benefit demands first, and the demands by actually the taxpayers to place capital more into new projects and new infrastructure often means, not always, but often means that maintenance gets shortchanged, and you see it time and time again. And we've seen it out here in the West Coast too, even in our local school system. That's an issue that's burning right now, and a number of the schools right here in Pierce County are very dilapidated because of the same dynamic. But coming back to the private sector, it's clear that around the world, actually, more and more infrastructure, be it highways or other forms of infrastructure, are being privatized. And, toll roads are being run by private companies all around the world, and quite successfully. So what's interesting is that New York and other metropolitan areas are so resistant to even experimenting with that kind of model. And one way to approach it, I think, would be to do it on an experimental basis. Why don't you just sell one portion of New York's extensive subway system to a private company and see how it works, and run the two in parallel and see which delivers better service, runs more cheaply, and so on and so forth. That would probably be difficult to get through a New York legislature, but it's worth trying.
I would think so. Difficult. I think that would be an understatement in its difficulty, and it's an understatement to say that it's worth trying. As we know that private enterprise is always more efficient than government enterprise. Any final thoughts, Rick?
Well, perhaps the successful privatization of just toll roads should be, and also ports should be more widely publicized, so that at least there's some indirect pressure put on government agencies and governors and legislators to measure up.
Okay. Rick, thanks for your input, and we'll see everybody next week on another episode of The Philosophical Angle. Thank you.
Thank you.